It was clear from the feedback that we needed to maybe get a refresher on the Engage page for the class. So that's what we're going to do to start this video.
So this is the course page. You'll see just quickly that each of the weeks is here. The other two areas that you're going to want to be aware of are the getting started areas and the primary source list areas. Those who've done discussions have already done this, and maybe other people have checked that out for other reasons. But a couple very quick notes on the Getting Started page. The Getting Started page is important because it tells you everything that you need to know for the course. There was a quick video welcome to kind of give you some overview of the course. For those of you who have mentioned needing some reminders on when assignments are due, some suggestions perhaps on how to tackle the assignments during the week, you should definitely check out the weekly term schedule that tells you all of the due dates, when everything's due in individual weeks, whether you're a discussion leader or not. I tried to create this as kind of an all-in-one breakdown of the course, all of the requirements, all of the assignments, etc. This is a discussion of the 4-question method. It is a overview of what the 4 questions are, what they're trying to get at. My suggestion, based on the first few discussion leader assignments that I've read, that people really need to take a look at this. I would also check out Leon's discussion last week on the Anti-Imperialist League. Particularly her response for the first 2 questions were exactly what we're looking for. And those of you who suggested in the assessment for last week an example should definitely check out that discussion if you haven't already. I mean, a lot of people commented on that one, but really take a look. That is almost precisely what I'm looking for, particularly the first 2 questions. This next document here is Finding Non-Textual Sources. This is a guide to how to find primary sources for your research project. So definitely check that out if you have not already. It's going to give you some basic tips on how to find some of these sources on the internet and how to get information that you're going to need for citations. This next document here is a PowerPoint presentation that reviews documentation guidelines. It gives a specific, and I noticed I think only one person, maybe 2 people have used this format for textbook references. So the rest of you need to check this document out to determine how to cite the textbook accurately. But there's also a very general guide to how to cite all of the other sources that you might come across in the course, including the discussion leader documents, including the sources, the non-textual sources for the course project. Then underneath that is the assignment descriptions for the 3 assignment types that we have in the class. The discussion leader, which includes the document ID assignment, the discussion leader assignment itself, and the response assignment. The forum discussion is a overview of what counts as a discussion and how those will be evaluated. According to the email that I sent earlier today, that document has been updated to reflect some concerns from students who rightly suggested that the instructions weren't clear enough. And then the last one to look at is the course project. And again, that's going to give you all of the rubrics that you need for those assignments. And as you can see, the week schedules, I'm just using week 2 as an example. Most of the weeks, or all of the weeks, should be set up almost identically, with obviously the content differences. We have a weekly video. Definitely check that out. It's going to be a recap of some of the things from the previous week, as this one is going to be heavy about. It will also give you some information on the upcoming chapter. This week we'll take a look at some sources. The next section is going to be the documents for discussion. These are documents that are selected by the discussion leaders. They will send their IDs on Monday night. I will scan them and include them in this section of the week page. The discussion leader assignment, these are the discussion leader assignments for the discussion leaders. You'll submit that by Thursday night here. And then from that, I will generate the various discussion forums that we'll be using from Friday through Sunday to conclude the discussion for the week. Then here, what you will find is when I grade the discussion.
So you'll be able to get that feedback. And that's about it. So we'll transition really quickly to the next part of the video.
So we want to spend some time in the video for this week talking about sources. Sources are really important for the class. We talk about sources with our discussion leader assignments. We are looking at a slightly different kind of source for our course project. And there's been enough confusion that it warrants an overview of sources in this week's video, because it's really important to emphasize how important sources are in history. There is a significant misunderstanding about what historians actually do, and this is indicative of some of the abstracts that I read from Sunday's assignment. Historians don't actually write about what happened. They're much less interested in the details of what happened and how it happened. Instead, what they are interested in is analyzing and talking about sources. Sources are the raw material of history, not what historians write. What historians write and what other people who write history are writing is, at least in the field of history, is part of a long-running conversation about the past, but significantly about evidence about the past and the various interpretations of that evidence. If you were to take an upper-level history class, you'd spend a lot of time specifically talking about the last part of that, the various interpretations of evidence that occur. We're going to, in this class, give you a very brief introduction and overview on interpretation. Before we get to that, we want to talk about what constitutes historical evidence, and how that better informs us about what happened in the past. Generally speaking, it is really important as beginning historians to focus on and interrogate the evidence to get the full meaning of a source. It is important to understand that these sources are not stand-ins for events or stand-ins for individuals. These are specific artifacts that have a very specific meaning within their very specific context. So yes, while say the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is an important document that talks about American foreign policy, that references Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, it is, in addition to that, perhaps more importantly than that, a very specific point in time, a very specific point of view, and that point of view has very specific consequences. And we want to talk about all of those things in addition to just simply telling us what the document says. So we want to interrogate the document rather than just simply taking it at face value. And really, that's what the 4 questions are all about. But where do we find sources? Where do historical sources come from? Well, typically, for a professional practicing historian, they will spend the bulk of their time in a place like this. This is the National Archives that's located in College Park, Maryland. This is the central location for all the federal government documents. There are archives in just about every library that exists, whether it be public, a public library or community library probably has some archives. Local historical societies have archives. University and college libraries have archives. Other institutions also have archives. And basically what archives are collections of different kinds of documents. They're housed in vast rooms like this, in various kinds of file boxes, and they are cataloged in a very specific way by professional archivists. Those archive contents can be usually found online or on site, and historians will typically identify different boxes that they want to look at. Those boxes will be brought out to a reading room similar to this one. As you can see, the various researchers are sitting at the tables, and they've got the research boxes there with the documents. We obviously don't have the luxury or the time or the resources to have our beginning history students go out to archives and do research. So there are a number of different ways that primary sources come to us as beginning historians in, say, a survey class. One of the more popular ways that we're all by now somewhat familiar with are these anthology collections, and we've been using 3 of them. This is the cover of one of them, and these are collections of published sources. So some of those documents are in repositories or in other archives, and some historian or institution or publisher or some other interest has come together to try to publish these documents for various reasons. Here, clearly this reader is designed for a college level history course. There are other sort of popular press anthologies of important documents that you can find at, say, a Barnes & Noble or another, say, an online bookstore or bookseller. And there are other places, presidents, usually famous individuals might have portions of their archives published. And again, this is specifically true for U.S. presidents who often, usually well after their death, have their papers published. In the information age, a lot of these sources, specifically from archives, are being digitized. 2 of the most common places to find these kinds of evidence, and I would completely support you going to either the Library of Congress or the National Archives websites shown here to find sources for your project. But you'll also be able to find sources on elsewhere on the web from people who might be interested in historical topics. History.com has articles that actually include primary sources, and it's important to distinguish those secondary sources like History.com from the primary sources that they're based on. And you want to be finding the primary sources, the images or the advertisements or the political cartoon, and not the writing about those things. So generally, the purpose of this video is sort of threefold here, in addition to sort of the overarching purpose of talking about sources. I want to take a little bit of time after the abstract assignment to reiterate an overview of the course project and specifically talk about some of the types of evidence that you might want to look for. In doing that, I'm going to also show you some not so useful primary sources that you might come across, that you might want to skip over and not use as primary sources. You can collect them, you can include them in your presentation, but they're not particularly useful primary sources for analysis. And the sources that I will look at in this video will be relevant to the chapters for this week. So the Progressive Era and World War I. We'll take a fairly extensive look at the women's movement within the context of both the Progressive Era and World War I. Then we'll take a very brief look at two other relevant topics. One being kind of the debates over entry into World War I, and then a very brief discussion about the very end of the chapter on World War I about Red Summer, specifically the Great Migration and the some of the racial tensions that emerge around the time of World War I. And we're going to sort of use those sources to preview the Progressive Era, which includes World War I, and also review the 4 questions. I'll be giving you kind of a very brief breakdown of how I might respond to the 4 questions for each of the sources that I show you. And when you find sources for your project, you don't need to submit the 4-question overview, but you should think about the 4 questions when you're analyzing the sources, because again, that's going to help you to understand the source better, understand where the author's coming from, understand their specific and unique perspective. When we talk about the role of women in the Progressive Era, you might, for example, be looking at an image like this of Carrie Nation described in the chapter. This image is indeed a primary source, but it is not particularly useful in terms of what this image proves. So what you would need to make more sense of this source is you would need some motivation from the photographer, who the photographer was, why they were taking that particular picture, why was Carrie Nation posed in that way, and frankly, you don't have that kind of information. That would be something that might, if at all, be contained in an archive, say, of the photographer. And so you'll see a number of other examples in this presentation of how plain photographs, while they are primary sources, and while historians have used photographs as primary source evidence, it's actually not going to be particularly useful for this assignment. Usually, if you were talking about Carrie Nation, you might want to flash a picture of Carrie Nation, but if you're looking for primary sources on, say, the temperance movement or the prohibition movement, you might instead look at a source like this. This is an abstinence pledge created by the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Pennsylvania. This isn't the greatest source, but this does tell you a little bit more information, and obviously it has text on it. It gives you a lot more information than the photograph. This source in particular, what this is an abstinence pledge. The author of the pledge, the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Pennsylvania, is fairly earnest in its support for temperance, so much so that it is asking people to sign this pledge in support of temperance. The context of this would be in the larger context of women activism, both in the 19th century, but also all the way up until 1918. So this is about a year after the Prohibition Amendment was passed, but still about a year and a half before it was ratified and took effect. But you would want to think about this in the context of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but you would also have to understand this document in the larger context of the temperance movement of the time. This was discussed in the chapter as well. And what is the significance of this document? On its face, it's not a particularly significant document in terms of changing history, but it is a significant document in the sense that it does demonstrate a certain amount of organization behind the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Pennsylvania, a certain amount of resources to, for example, print off a number of these pledges, a certain amount of organization to get these pledges signed by various people. Here's an image of one of the settlement houses. This too is a primary source, but it's a photograph. We don't know who these people are in the image, and unless you could find, say, information about who these people are, you don't know, but you would know by inference that these are largely immigrants, and you can see probably standing are the settlement house workers. But beyond that, you can't really make any conclusions or analysis of this image because you don't really know what the image is. You don't know what the motivation is of the author. But what you could do is find a document like this one. Now, a better version of this, and it's actually fully expandable, can be found. And so this is a primary source in the sense that it is a product of the settlement house and specifically the Hull House movement. And you can gather any number of bits of information from that. Here's another photograph. This gives you a little bit more information, but here too, even though there's a little bit more detail here, not a particularly useful image as a primary source. Instead, you have something like a postcard that is presented very much like a political cartoon. And so you could think about this again with the 4 questions. Who is the Votes for Women publishing company, and why are they publishing this particular postcard? What is the purpose of it? I mean, it seems like a campaigning tool in the context of women's suffrage. In terms of what the authors are thinking, they're critiquing who created the dirty pool of politics. They're basically suggesting that men have ruined politics, have created the dirty pool, and that women should be given a chance to clean it up. The context would be in the larger women's movement again, but you could also look at the role of the middle class, the specific issues that are addressed in this image, how they're reforming urban politics, and then finally, here's an image of the munitions factory during World War I. This is useful in the sense that it does show women working in labor, but it doesn't do much more than that. You don't really know what factory this is. You don't exactly know what she's doing there, although you know she's making some sort of casing for a munition. You don't really know who she is. You don't really know the conditions of her labor. You don't really know what the motivations are for her working or for the person who's taking the photograph. These aren't particularly useful sources for the project. But if you were to find something like this explains in textual detail the reasoning for women working in any number of fields during the war. This is a much clearer example. This is from the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Company. And here the message could not be clearer about the relationship between women's role in World War I and their views on the 19th Amendment. So we'll switch gears really quickly to a brief discussion about the debate surrounding the entrance of the United States into World War I. This is a really good example of kind of an event here that is being covered in this case by the New York Times. But it's important to note that while, of course, this article and the New York Times generally is a reputable historical source, the thing that you're looking at right here is not itself a legitimate historical source. This is a representation of a historical source. If you wanted to use this source, you could, but you would have to go actually find the text of the article. The headline is merely a headline. If you're looking to use a newspaper article, you actually have to go find the newspaper article. This is a war bond poster from World War I. You can get your 4 questions. What is this? This is an advertisement for citizens to buy war bonds, or Liberty bonds in this case, that would support this specific effort. What were they thinking? They were thinking that they needed to convince people that it was worth buying these war bonds and justifying it by connecting it to the very clear danger posed by the U-boats brought about by, say, the experience of the Lusitania. The context is the effort on the part of the federal state to raise funds for the war effort. And you can talk a little bit about the story of this particular advertisement. The story of the Lusitania is in there, the importance of the freedom of the high seas, which is an important principle under which the United States enters the war. Read Wilson's War Appeal is one of the documents for this week. And here's another kind of example of a really good source type, but sort of giving a little bit more background on how to actually find a good, accurate representation of the source. This is a song, clearly an anti-war song, as you can see at the very top there, A Mother's Plea for Peace. It's a song called Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier. This is what is called a song sheet. This is a representation of a song, but this is not the song. So it's important to understand that, like, you could use this as a representation of the song, but if you're going to use the song as a source for analysis, you're actually going to have to find the song. And that requires a little bit more effort. So if you were to, say, Google the song and find lyrics, you'd be able to find these lyrics. You can find this song on YouTube, and you can link to that. Another kind of significant event that happens at the end of World War I is the outbreak of racial violence in northern cities, specifically in 1919 in Chicago. A major racial riot. The end of chapter 21 does describe conditions in northern cities a little bit. So again, just to reiterate the point about newspaper headlines or images of front pages of newspapers, you can't really use those as sources, but you can go to a database and find the actual newspaper article. But we're going to go a little bit more efficiently, and in this case, again, there's hundreds of different sources you can find that will talk about the Red Summer that's described in the textbook. But we're going to kind of continue along the lines of sort of illustrating what is and is not a good source for the project. And we're going to look at one of the kind of precursors, one of the bits of context to this Red Summer, and that is, of course, the Great Migration. Here are a couple of representations of the Great Migration, but it's important to note that none of these are actually primary sources. These are all secondary sources, like this chart. So this source would be created using, say, census data on population numbers and the racial breakdown of population numbers in these large cities. So this graph is a representation of primary source data, the raw data of history, but it itself is not a primary source. This is a map. This is a visual representation of the Great Migration. Doesn't really show much about numbers, but does definitely show geographical migration patterns. But this too is not actually a primary source. This is a secondary source that uses data from primary sources. But something like this would be a primary source. And this is something that I just found by Google searching Great Migration advertisement. Just is another example of an efficient source. I mean, it gives you some information. It allows you to make connections to the textbook and the larger history of the United States. And it does so while being a reliable primary source. And we'll hit you next week with another video. We'll be looking at the emergence of the United States as a superpower. This seemed to be a fairly popular chapter, so I'm interested in looking at that and talking about that next week. Also interested in the collection of documents for this week. There will be another one up. Looking forward to that discussion. We'll talk to you soon.